We're going to continue on with our questions about the nature of theological knowledge. And we're going to start off with some hard terms as we usually do. Remember, so much of systematic theology is rooted in understanding the vocabulary and how all of this fits together. Um, Maybe sometime I'll talk a little bit about my view of general epistemology, because I think my view of general epistemology informs the way I handle theological epistemology. But what I want you to learn is vocabulary, ways of piecing things together. Reform scholastic theology um, really built on some medieval distinctions that really helped to identify uh, categories that help us understand this tension of the incomprehensibility of God and Him being truly knowable. So, how do we do this? How do we build this true but not total conceptual framework? Well, two words, archetypal and ectypal. Theologia archetypa is archetypal theology. That is God's own perfect, infinite self knowledge. What do we mean by that? God knows himself. He knows himself exhaustively and immediately. He's not learning more about himself. God's knowledge, therefore, is identical with his own being. He knows himself completely. But then there is also this notion of theologia ectypa, or ectypal theology. This is the derivative, finite, creaturely knowledge of God that he graciously grants to creatures. The word comes from the Greek ektypos, meaning a copy or an impression. It's stamped or impressed from God's own archetypal self-knowledge, but it is necessarily adapted to finite capacity. Okay, here's why this matters. All human theology, including everything in this course, is ectypal. What we mean by that is it is a true copy. It's not a fabrication, but it's also not identical to God's own infinite self-knowledge. We need to understand this distinction. What we know of God can be true. What we know of God can be a complete copy, but not complete in the sense that it is everything of God. Complete in the sense that it's what God has conveyed to us. This distinction guards against two errors at once. Skepticism, we can know God. Since ectypal knowledge is true, it's genuinely true, it's not an illusion, it's not a rationalistic overreach. But we can also guard ourselves because ectypal knowledge is never exhausted. It's never self-generated. This gets into the notion of what's known as divine divine accommodation. How does an infinite God communicate truly to finite creatures? Theologians, modern theologians, following hints that were actually already present in some of the work of John Calvin, speak of what's called divine accommodation. That is, that God graciously condescends and adapts his self-revelation to human capacity. It's the same way that a parent simplifies without falsifying truth for a child, or the same way in which a skilled teacher lisps, to use Calvin's own image to communicate with limited learners. It is self-revelation accommodated to human capacity. Accommodation does not mean that God's revelation is false. It's not exaggerated, and it's not merely symbolic. It's rather revelation that is adapted in form and mode so that we can genuinely receive it without there being any falsification of content. Well, how does this all work? We get two fancy words, anthropomorphic and anthropopathic language. This is, for example, God's hand, God's eyes, God's anger, God's regret. These are all anthropomorphic and anthropopathic language. Language that truly communicates God's actions and characters, but using categories drawn from human experience. When we say that, the hand of God is at work, we don't mean that God has a physical bodily hand. Or when we say that God was angry or regretted, we're not saying that God has changeable passions. We're going to get to this more in weeks 4 and 5. What we are doing is we are accommodating to human experiences and human language to capture something that is incomprehensible. So accommodation is ultimately and supremely realized in the incarnation. It says the Word became flesh so that the invisible God might be seen. Jesus Christ accommodated himself to human nature itself, becoming flesh so that we might know God. That's the ultimate in divine accommodation. So let's dig in just a little bit more. Another classical distinction concerns how we speak about God. Cataphatic or positive theology speaks of God using positive affirmations. So an example of this is that God is good, God is loving, God is just, God is wise. These are cataphatic, positive statements, positive affirmations. Apophatic or negative theology speaks of God through the role of logical negation, denying God of anything that would be inappropriate to his perfection. So an example of this: God is not finite. God is not changeable. God is not composed of parts. Both of these are actually necessary and biblical. Let me give an example. 1 John says plainly that God is love. That's positive predication. That's a cataphatic statement. Numbers, though, says that God is not man. Specifically says God is not man that he should lie. James says that there is no variation with God. These are apophatic statements about God. Historic theology has generally held that cataphatic statements about God, while true, need to be recognized as this important, I would say, qualification. God possesses every perfection infinitely and in a manner appropriate to his own unique, uncreated being, not merely as a bigger version of the corresponding finite creaturely quality. Okay, let me say that in a different way. When we say God is love, we're not saying that God is this human characteristic called love, just in a better way. That's actually the wrong way of thinking about it. We always should go from the divine down to the human. So when we say God is love, we are saying God is love. And then when we say that we love someone, we are saying that we are imaging that love that God has. We need to always make a qualitative distinction between the creator and the creature whenever we're using this. What we're saying is that God possesses every perfection infinitely in a manner that's appropriate to his own unique, uncreated being. So this gives us some tools, and we are going to continue on here in just a moment to talk about how sin interacts with all of this.